Hello, and welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today, we're going to learn about the 2017 movie called Darkest Hour. Darkest Hour is a biographical film about Winston Churchill that was directed by Joe Wright and earned Gary Oldman an Oscar for Best Performance by an Actor in a Leading Role for his portrayal of Churchill. It also earned an Oscar for Best Achievement in Makeup and Hairstyling for the team behind Gary Oldman's remarkable visual transformation in the movie. The storyline of the movie is set during May of 1940, just after Winston Churchill becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and immediately he's faced with decisions that could alter the course of World War II. Will Germany invade England? Do they negotiate with Adolf Hitler? Can they get their soldiers out of Dunkirk? To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, we'll be joined by Dr. J. Furman Daniel, who is an associate professor of strategy at the National War College. So, before we continue, here is a little disclaimer. The views expressed in this episode do not represent the views or opinions of the Department of Defense, the federal government, or the National War College. Today, Furman will be joining us as the author behind an upcoming book called Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint, the remarkable year that made Winston Churchill. Before we chat with Furman, though, it's time to set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Churchill didn't really visit the subway to see how British people felt about peace with Germany. Number 2, Miss Layton was Churchill's secretary through the evacuation of Dunkirk. Number 3, the climactic speech at the end of the movie was shown on the wrong day. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Furman Daniel about the historical accuracy of Darkest Hour. The last time we talked, it was about the movie Young Winston, and that movie ends with Winston Churchill as he's elected to Parliament, which I believe was in 1901. And today we're going to be talking about Darkest Hour, which is a movie that starts in 1940. So there's like a 39-year gap between the timeline of the movies. And for someone like Winston Churchill, I'm sure it could be an entire episode by itself just talking about that gap. But could you fill in the gap with an overview of Winston Churchill's life between the timelines of the last movie, Young Winston, and today's movie, Darkest Hour?
Well, Dan, it's great to be back on the show. And you started off with the exact right question, kind of what happened in between those 2 movies, 39 years. The short answer is Churchill lived 5 lifetimes worth of stuff. He literally did things that if you just did one of them, it would be a pretty doggone good life. He made and lost millions of dollars. He was a best-selling author. He had children. He redrew the maps of the Middle East and inadvertently created a lot of the problems we're dealing with now in the Middle East. He learned how to fly. He almost died in a car wreck in New York where he looked the wrong way because he's British. He looked the wrong way, stepped in front of a cab, and almost died. He fought in World War I. He held about a dozen different political offices. You could go on and on and on. And the reason why so many of the Churchill books are so long and all that is because he did so much. For the purposes of this movie, to talk about kind of Darkest Hour, I want to highlight kind of 4 things that happened during this period that are really relevant for the Darkest Hour movie. One is he switched parties not once, but twice. So he was initially elected as a conservative in 1901. In 1904, he kind of reads the tea leaves of British politics and sees that public opinion is actually shifting towards the Liberal Party. So on the issue of free trade, he decides to switch in 1904, just 3 years after starting his career, switch from the Conservative Party to the Liberal Party. He serves as a liberal for 21 years. And then in 1925, he again kind of reads the broader political situation and says, oh, the kind of political winds are shifting the other way. I am going to become a conservative again. and kind of changes party and then changes again. So for the purpose of this movie, a lot of why Churchill was distrusted, a lot of why he was seen as kind of an unreliable figure was because he not only switched parties once, but he did it twice. And he did so in a way that seemed kind of politically opportunistic, disloyal, all that. Second thing that happens in this period is in 1908, he marries his soulmate. He marries Clementine Hauser, and she really becomes the rock which he kind of uses for support, his soulmate, and the movie does a really good job of talking about their relationship and really showing that she was someone he trusted, and she was someone who had the strength of character to stand up to one of the biggest, strongest personalities of all time. And I really think you cannot understand Churchill's success without understanding that relationship with Clementine. The third thing that happens that's relevant for the movie is during World War I, he's First Lord of the Admiralty, the kind of civilian head of the Royal Navy. And it's his idea, and under his leadership, the British forces invade modern-day Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, try to force Turkey out of the war, and the operation's an absolute disaster. They talk about Gallipoli and the Dardanelles as one of his most prominent failures and a very prominent military failure during World War I. Still in World War II, people saw this as a prime example of why Churchill should not be trusted to make military decisions, how he was dangerous, and kind of would come up with these wonderful schemes that sounded great, but that he couldn't really deliver on, and therefore he's a dangerous person to have as prime minister. And then finally, from 1929 to 1940, 1929 to 1939, Winston Churchill's out of office. He still holds his seat in Parliament, but he does not get any kind of high office position in the British government. This is known by biographers as his wilderness period. And during this period, Churchill kind of fails publicly again and again and again. He opposes Gandhi and British policy in India. He's on the wrong side of a whole bunch of economic issues surrounding the Great Depression. He's on the wrong side of the abdication crisis with King Edward and then King George. And he also is one of the few people saying, hey, Great Britain needs to be careful about Adolf Hitler. He's ultimately proven correct that Adolf Hitler was dangerous and should be opposed. But for almost this entire period, he's sounding like an unreliable kind of person who's sounding the alarm bells when they didn't need to be sounded. So this 10-year period, Churchill is seen as being on the wrong side of all these issues. And it kind of, again, furthers this view that he's unreliable, furthers this view that he's kind of a political showman, an opportunist, and someone who actually you wouldn't want as the prime minister during this kind of moment of crisis. So those are kind of the four big things I would like to highlight as they relate to this movie.
Reminds me of like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Like you keep saying things over and over again, and then it sounds like, I mean, obviously we know from history, with Hitler, he was correct, but still, if he had all these other things that he was wrong about, he wouldn't know.
Yeah, and Churchill saw them as a principled stand, right? At the time, he was seen as kind of a political opportunist. And, he thought, for example, on Gandhi, that the British should not give up their empire. And he saw that as a principled stand. And so it forced him into positions of opposing legitimate grievances from the Indian people and opposing Gandhi, someone who's now seen as a wonderful kind of example of peaceful leadership and anti-colonialist kind of change. Churchill put himself in the position of taking a principled stand in a way that was not supported by the majority of the people. And in the case of Gandhi, at least, has not been borne out by history. In the case of Hitler, the people also didn't want it. The people had very bad memories from World War I. The Great Depression had damaged the British economy. So the last thing they wanted to do was get in an arms race with Germany again when they could be using that money on something else. The last thing they wanted to do was get in a war with Germany again when Great Britain had suffered several million casualties during the First World War. Why would you want to do that again? And it was kind of a willing disregard by many people in British politics, many people in the British public. It was a kind of a willing disregard of fact. Germany was rearming. It was clear that they were doing so, but they told themselves this: well, we don't need to worry about this. Germany would not be foolish enough to go war. Hitler doesn't really mean what he says. He's not, just don't take him at his word. This is something we can deal with on the negotiation table. This is something we can ignore. And Churchill, quite rightly, no, this is not something we can negotiate with. This is not something that we can ignore. We need to start building weapons. We need to start making preparations now so that if this does become violent, we can fight, or better yet, we can deter Nazi aggression before it starts. But he wasn't listened to then. And again, it kind of frames this, I like the way you said it, the boy that cried wolf kind of problem that he'd had for a 10-year period leading up to World War II.
Yeah, well, like I said, that gap period could be an entire thing by itself. But if we shift back to the movie Darkest Hour, before we dig into the details of that, what letter grade would you give it for its historical accuracy?
This is really tough. I would give it about a C- for historical accuracy. And the reason why I say it's tough is it gets so many little details and kind of character study elements 100% right. And it's such a beautifully done movie in a lot of ways. But it gets also so many things wrong. And if you don't know what to look for, wrong in a particularly kind of confusing way, wrong on the timeline, wrong on kind of the order of how things happen and why. It overplays the severity of some of the opposition towards Churchill. It invents scenes that we can talk about later, but it invents scenes like some of his meetings with the king and his trip in the London Underground where he gets strength from the British people and stuff like that. There's no historical evidence that any of this happened. And it's quite frankly unbelievable. Makes for great movie scenes, but unfortunately didn't happen. The kind of way I was thinking about this, and I'm having a hard time putting this into words, but it's almost like the concept of the uncanny valley with humanoid robots. If you make something, paradoxically enough, if you make a robot, a human robot that looks very close to a human, but not quite right, you get this repulsion, what they call the uncanny valley of it's close enough to be weird and it's close enough to make you repulsed. As a biographer of Churchill, I kind of found myself in this Churchill uncanny valley, to borrow a term. It gets so many things right, and it also gets so many things wrong. And some of the things it gets right are so incredibly minor, and that if you don't know what to look for, you would miss it. But then it gets like huge things wrong in a way that is frustrating and maddening. So I have to give it kind of a low C, despite the fact I really enjoyed the movie. Historically, it's not very good.
That's because, as you were saying that, it reminds me of, I talked to a historian about Saving Private Ryan, and he was talking about how that is a great example of how to do a movie because it's fictional. Like Private Ryan's not a real person, but so they're not trying to follow something that is, you're going to have that uncanny valley, effect of something, but it is still historical in some way. But the filmmakers then have the freedom to make up a bunch of stuff, and you're not going to believe that it's real anyway, because you know that this storyline's not really real. As opposed to Churchill, he's a real person, so you're going to assume that this is what really happened.
Yeah, and in the moment, I found myself caught up in it, and I had to say, while you're watching it, your brain tricks you. Oh wow, this is great, and then you think, wait, that I know better. What I worry about, as a biographer, as a historian, and an educator, I worry about people that see it and really like it and then just assume, hey, this is all true. I can put it in my book report or base my idea of how World War II happened based on that. And in that way, I actually, I'm going to sound like the snobby historian, it actually is kind of dangerous. It is because it's so good and because it gives that appearance of a very high production value. It actually creates more problems. And again, I'm kind of stuck in this Churchill uncanny valley.
Well, hopefully people aren't basing their reports on actual movies. I mean, the whole concept of my show would be out if everybody just believed them all to be true.
People do all the time. I to kind of get us sidetracked, I had to often tell people that like Braveheart is really not real, or that Gladiator really, sorry guys, fun movie, great special effects, not real. Students, I think this is just students, but people want to believe certain narratives about history, and they want to believe the story arc that's provided for them. And doing research is hard. Watching a movie is fun and easy. And I'm guilty of this too. When you're in the moment, it's very hard to kind of separate out, oh, this really did happen, and no, that this really didn't happen. And that's why your podcast exists.
Your mention of Gladiator reminds me of a story. So my background's in visual effects. And I remember when that movie came out, hearing visual effects artists who were laughing about how critics were saying everything looks realistic except for that tiger. And they were laughing because the filmmakers actually had a real tiger on set. Obviously, they had to keep it at a distance from Russell Crowe, but it was kind of a joke in the circles of the visual effects artists that I was around, because people were saying that the tiger looked like fake CGI when really they had rebuilt the Roman Colosseum in CGI, but the tiger was actually real.
They're like, it's one of those memes, like, so you're saying what's real is actually what's not real. Yeah. All right.
Okay, let's shift back to the movie. At the beginning of Darkest Hour, happening in May of 1940, and according to the movie, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, has lost the faith of Parliament, so they're looking to replace him. And Viscount Halifax is the first choice, but he declines. Even though his own party doesn't really seem to like him, according to the movie, Winston Churchill is put up as the only conservative who the opposition will support. So then Chamberlain resigns and King George appoints Churchill. Is that a pretty good depiction of how Churchill was actually become the British Prime Minister?
Dan, I think it is. It's obviously a very complex set of political issues and calculations, but for the purpose of the movie, that is a very good kind of short way of introducing that problem and kind of setting up some of the tension underlying Churchill's position as newly elected prime minister.
Well, that leads to my next question, because in the movie, we see, even though Churchill is appointed as the prime minister, in his first speech that he gives, people are actually watching Chamberlain to see if he waves his handkerchief to show support for Churchill. So then they would follow suit. Like, oh, if Chamberlain supports Churchill, then we're going to support Churchill, is the impression that I got. So I found that interesting, because it seems like the movie just said that Parliament has lost faith in Chamberlain, and that's the whole reason why he's being replaced. And then it's like, oh, but not everybody, obviously, because some people are still following Chamberlain's lead. So it never really seems to dig into why Chamberlain lost the faith of Parliament, why he resigned. Can you clarify some of the reasons why Chamberlain stepped down?
Sure. Well, first of all, the handkerchief as a signal to the party, whether to support or not support Churchill, there's no evidence that actually happened. It's a creative kind of device that the filmmakers did. And again, it's one of those, you can easily be tricked because it seems like something you could do or you would do. To the broader question, it's important to remember that, as I said before, Churchill was not trusted, and old wounds heal very slowly. And there were people that had known Churchill for 30, 40 years and seen him as someone that they should not trust, someone that was dangerous, someone that was a schemer, someone that would gladly stab them in the back if he could get higher office or some kind of fame or fortune out of it. So a lot of it was a personal dislike of Churchill. Some of it was also a personal like of Neville Chamberlain. Neville Chamberlain was a true gentleman. He was a very kind of sincere leader, and he was someone that, in his own way, in his kind of understated way, kind of the contrast to Churchill, got quite a bit of loyalty from his political supporters. The other thing to remember, and it's always hard as an American, people didn't serve fixed terms. They served at the kind of whim of whatever coalition they could build in Parliament. So Churchill was able to kind of peel off some conservative votes who thought Chamberlain was not an effective war leader, And he was able to also peel off liberal and labor votes who realized they didn't have the votes to put their own candidate as up as prime minister, but Churchill seemed more acceptable to them. He would fight the war more aggressively, and he did have this kind of liberal streak in him that appealed to some of the members of the liberal and labor parties. So it's kind of one of those things. A lot of this was personal. There, much like today, there is no single Tory or single liberal party. Just like there's no single Democrat or Republican party in America. There's factions within each one. A lot of that's personal, or a lot of that's also regional and things like that. And then also it's worth remembering the prime minister isn't elected in the kind of same way they are in a president would be elected in the United States. They have to build a coalition. So oddly enough, the fact that Churchill had been in both major parties and was seen as this kind of somebody, well, at least he'll fight, made him acceptable to enough conservatives and acceptable to enough liberal and labor party members to where he could get that vote to force Neville Chamberlain out, and then get a coalition that he could build to actually be prime minister himself.
Sounds like what hurt him before switching parties ended up helping him in the long run.
It's always a temptation to say, as a historian, when you know what the answer to something is, there's always the temptation to say, and it all worked out perfectly. So you always have to pull back and say, well, at the time they didn't know that. With kind of historical perspective, in retrospect, we can say a lot of Churchill's life built up to this, and kind of the very things that made him a bad option during peacetime, or a bad option when there wasn't this kind of crisis of government, actually made him a very effective wartime leader and an option that was attractive to both political parties.
Well, after that first speech in the movie, that's the blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech. The same people who put him in power in the movie, now they're saying that they want to get rid of Churchill so they can try to negotiate peace with Nazi Germany. And then Chamberlain finally convinces Halifax to put his name back in the ring as a replacement. And this was something that I was kind of confused with how the movie portrays this, because on one hand, Churchill's stance on Germany never seems to falter. So it seems like the politicians in his own party should know that before trying to make him prime minister. But then I kind of got the impression that maybe they were trying to make him the prime minister so that he could publicly fail, and then they could replace him with who they really wanted. But then in the movie, we see when they wanted to replace Churchill with Halifax at the very beginning, Halifax turns it down. He says he doesn't want to be prime minister. It's not his time yet, or something like that. So again, the movie seems to keep suggesting that no one wanted Churchill in power. So again, I'll ask you this time with Halifax to clarify this. Why would they want to replace Churchill so quickly with someone that they just offered him that position in the movie?
Yeah, and here's one of the things where I think the movie exaggerates. I think they exaggerate a lot of the kind of political scheming behind the scenes. Well, we'll bait Churchill into being prime minister. We'll have him publicly fail and kind of get out in front of the issue and be too hard on fighting the war to the bitter end. And then we'll stab him in the back and put our person that we've always wanted in. I'm sure people thought that way a little bit, but the kind of big picture was they knew Halifax was problematic, and Halifax had already turned down his opportunity to be prime minister. It turns out Halifax was very shy, and he was kind of saw himself as a background type leader, right? I'm going to be very involved in the policy. I'm going to help build coalitions, but I am not a kind of charismatic, be out front of a crowd, give a rousing speech type leader. The other thing with Halifax is it would have actually created a constitutional crisis to try to make him prime minister. He was actually a member of the House of Lords, and under British law, you couldn't be a member of the House of Lords and be prime minister. You had to be a member of the House of Commons. So it would have, in addition to kind of Halifax didn't want the job and was self-aware enough to know he wasn't really the right person for that job, it also would have provoked a completely different crisis in government that would have caused problems. I understand why the movie didn't say that, but the setting up Halifax as this kind of conniving Machiavellian villain waiting in the shadows to stab Churchill in the back, I think is deeply unfair to Halifax. And I think kind of is, again, one of those, unless you really kind of do a deep dive of the history, is an easy narrative to buy into. Oh, of course, this guy didn't understand Churchill and wanted to stab him in the back. Makes for a great story. It also, in this case, isn't completely true. And like I said, I think it's deeply unfair to Halifax.
Yeah. Which, as you were saying that, the constitutional crisis, and earlier you had talked about the abdication of King Edward, which in itself was a constitutional crisis of something that they hadn't had. So again, thinking of the historical context here, you don't want multiple things. They already had this crisis to figure out, and then this other aspect. It makes sense the movie wouldn't dive into that, but also it makes sense from a historical perspective why Halifax wouldn't be the right choice.
Now, one thing that the movie does do is Halifax did think a negotiated settlement was the right thing for Britain. So it doesn't make that up, but it does kind of exaggerate the I'm going to stab Churchill in the back and then cut a deal.
Is that uncanny valley you're talking about?
Yeah,
a little bit of
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned this briefly, but throughout the movie, there is a faction within the British government who wants to negotiate peace with Germany. And then as the movie puts, I think the words that they use are that Germany has our country's entire professional soldiery trapped at Dunkirk. Despite this, according to the movie, Winston Churchill seems to be basically the only person who refuses to negotiate because he doesn't believe Hitler is someone who can be reasoned with. And he seems to be the only one who thinks that Hitler is the madman that he is. Of course, again, looking at it from a historical perspective, we know things differently. But at the time, was Churchill really the biggest reason that Britain didn't negotiate with Germany like the movie suggests?
So I'll kind of split your question up a little bit. The biggest reason, yes, absolutely. But not the only reason. And we need to be really careful not kind of overstating this. So Churchill absolutely wanted to fight. And he saw Hitler as someone who could not be negotiated with, could not be reasoned with, and that to do so would be dangerous. So the movie gets that 100% right, and is a character study on kind of the stubbornness and kind of hatred of Adolf Hitler and everything he stood for. 100% correct. There were lots of other people in the British government that also thought along these lines, and Churchill was not the only one, the way the movie would kind of have you suggest, or would suggest for you to believe. So it's important not to overstate if it wasn't for Churchill, everybody else was willing to cut a deal and we'd all be speaking German today. I just think that's a dangerous kind of set of assumptions to make, but one that if you only watch the movie, you could easily kind of see yourself going down that track. One thing the movie doesn't do enough kind of on is the importance of Dunkirk for keeping the British Army in the fight. So there is kind of this alternate world where if the British cannot save a large portion of their army off the beaches at Dunkirk, and 200,000 or 300,000 of their soldiers are dead or captured by the Nazi, then their ability to continue fighting is greatly reduced. And potentially the idea of 200,000 or 300,000 soldiers being used as political pawns, being used as kind of prisoners of war to get a better deal out of the British. You could imagine something like that. The movie talks about Dunkirk, but shows that it is very important. It actually doesn't do enough about this keeps Britain in the war and makes resistance a much easier sell to the British people and a much less challenging kind of military and political problem. And I know this movie came out about the same time as Dunkirk. I think it's almost like you should do a Barbieheimer kind of feature. I guess you'd call it Darkest Kirk or something like that. Those two movies, when kind of put together, actually fill out the kind of political and military situation pretty well. But if you just watch Darkest Hour, you might not kind of fully comprehend the massive scale of the British rescue effort at Dunkirk and kind of how important that was politically to show that someone like Churchill could actually pull off something like the Dunkirk and exfil, but also kind of militarily, oh, wow, we saved the majority of our professional army right out from under the noses of the Nazi army. And now we have a professional force that's at home that can protect the homeland and that can be built out and actually used for a cross-channel invasion later. So it really kind of doesn't get how important that was in saving not only Churchill's political career, but the British military and the British kind of ability to continue to resist.
Yeah, which I mean, to some degree, I could understand that. That Dunkirk is a whole other story too. Again, obviously, could be a movie in and of itself. So yeah. Yeah. Speaking of Dunkirk, though, one thing that we do see in Darkest Hour is Churchill seems to be the one to have the idea. He tells Admiral Ramsay to call for an assembly of civilian boats to help evacuate the soldiers trapped at Dunkirk. Was it really Churchill's idea to use civilian boats?
So, no. Churchill allowed that to go on. He pushed very hard to use civilian boats and to use the Royal Navy to do so. But no, the Admiralty had actually been planning various different kind of ways to use civilian craft for pretty much the entire war. And the small boats thing is also one of those things when we talk about Dunkirk, the small boats and the kind of individual patriotic British citizens going out in groups of ones and twos to pull people off the beach is also a very tiny part of the actual Dunkirk operation. I've seen estimates that maybe only 10 or 20,000 of the soldiers were saved by the small boats. You know, if you're one of those 10 or 20,000, or if that's your brother or dad, it's really important. But about 300,000 Allied soldiers were pulled off the beach during the Operation Dynamo exercise. A very small percent were pulled off by small craft. Most of them were done by large craft that could actually come up to the dock there right off the beach and load hundreds at a time rather than onesies and twosies on small boats. So the small boats thing wasn't really Churchill's idea. It also wasn't a particularly large part of the Dunkirk thing, despite the fact it's just the memorable part, and it's the fun part, and it's the kind of heroic, great story about the British people coming together. Unfortunately, it's not that important, really.
It's something. Speaking of the rescue there at Dunkirk, I have to ask, because in the movie, Churchill's on the phone with Ramsay, and he's like, "Oh, we need a name for the operation." And Ramsay just looks down to a fan sitting on the ground, and the brand name of the fan is Dynamo. And of course, we know from history that the rescue at Dunkirk is Operation Dynamo. Was it really named after a fan?
No, and that's one of the kind of enduring legends about the Dunkirk operation is that it was named after a fan or an air conditioner. And there's various different versions of this, but they've pretty much all been debunked. Some people say Churchill did it. Some people say Ramsay did it. Some people say Admiralty planners did it. No, it's not named after a fan, even though there were fans named Dynamo, and even though the operation became known as Operation Dynamo.
I was going to say, how do you not turn that into some sort of marketing or ad campaign? I'm sure that would have to be, if that's actually true.
Yeah, no, not true. Sorry.
Makes for a good moment in the movie, but not true. There you go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another idea that Churchill has in the movie to help the soldiers at Dunkirk is to order a garrison at Calais to engage with the German columns for as long as possible. As the movie puts it, they're sacrificing the 4,000 men there to save the 300,000 men at Dunkirk. Although the movie makes it clear that Churchill seems to think it would be a miracle to get 10% of that 300,000 out. But Churchill sends a telegram to the man in charge at Calais, the Brigadier Nicholson is his name. And he basically says, your men are not going to be evacuated. The movie makes it clear that this is a sacrifice operation. Then almost immediately after that, we see German bombers flying over. They drop bombs, and we see a message saying that Calais has fallen. How well did the movie do telling what happened at Calais?
Overall, that's a good summation of some of the military and planning problems that Churchill had to deal with. What the Allies did is they put a defensive perimeter as far out as they possibly could around the Dunkirk beaches. And if you're in that defensive perimeter, your orders were to delay the German army as long as you possibly could. There were garrisons at Calais. There were garrisons all along this kind of defensive perimeter. And they basically were suicide units. You will be sacrificed, but you will save, hopefully, tens of thousands of people with your sacrifice. What the movie doesn't talk about, it oversimplifies a whole bunch of very complex military movements. The French army actually provided a lot of that kind of defensive perimeter. So the French sacrifice to allow the Dunkirk evacuations, very, very important. And you don't really hear about it in the movie. I get why, but you don't. The other thing is the Churchill and the Admiralty planners did think maybe they could get 20, 30, 40,000 people off the beach. So about 10%. Their initial estimates were much lower than what they actually got off. The German army actually was slowed down by these kind of perimeter defense units that sacrificed to pull off the thing. And then actually Hitler ordered his advancing units to stop for a couple of days. It's one of those kind of great debates in history. Why did Hitler order them to stop? Did he think the Allies were about to bargain with them and that he could get a better deal if he was nice? Were the units overextended and needed to regroup? So it's just a military stop that was necessitated by them kind of outrunning their supplies. Was it that he believed his chief of air, Hermann Goering, that they could bomb the beachheads into surrendering? There's still to this day an open question about kind of why the German panzers stopped for as long as they did. The fact of the matter is a combination of these things, the perimeter units fighting very hard, the German army stopping, and then an extraordinary effort from mostly big ships from the Royal Navy pulling those people off the beach, far exceeded anything Churchill or the Admiralty planners were imagining when they first ordered the operation. Like I said, they saved about 300,000 when some of their early estimates were 20, 30, 40,000. It was a miracle at Dunkirk. I mean, it truly kept the British army in the war and kind of saved, a third of a million people almost. Churchill understood this as kind of the deliverance of the British army from certain destruction. He also did caution, however, that wars are not won by evacuations, was kind of his wonderful one-liner, right? There is still hard fighting left to do, but thank God we were, not completely destroyed so that we can do that hard fighting later.
In the movie, soon after Calais falls, we hear, I think it's General Ironside telling how the Germans are likely going to invade England. He says that they're going to use fast motorboats with 100 to 200 men each, and they're going to land on the coast simultaneously with airborne raids, and there's really nothing that Britain can do to prevent these landings. And then he tells Churchill that we have to start preparing for an imminent invasion. We don't really see if they do any of their preparations in the movie, but at least is it correct to suggest that the military suggested that they needed to prepare for an invasion?
Yes, there was quite a bit of fear that the German army would be able to rapidly transport across the English Channel and invade England. There was also lots of fear and paranoia about German paratroopers landing in Great Britain as well. Interestingly enough, this is one of the things that while there was a lot of fear at the time, and I don't want to discount the fears of military planners and the fears of the British public, this actually was not a particularly realistic thing for the Germans to do. Germany was primarily a land power. They did not have a large navy. They, would not have been able to do this type of operation as described in the movie. They just didn't have the number of ships. They didn't have the kind of heavy airlift capacity to get a large portion of their army in airplanes and move them across even a relatively small amount of water, the British Channel. Churchill, interestingly enough, after kind of the initial invasion scares were over, actually wanted the Germans to try to invade because he thought they would fail and lose a large part of their army in a failed invasion. But it turns out now that the Germans, especially right after the defeat of France, were not in a position to be able to directly invade the British coast. And if they'd have tried, they would have almost certainly failed because they would not have been able to get a large number of people over. They would not have been able to keep them fed, keep them supplied with ammunition and things like that you need to fight, and would have almost certainly lost. having said that, to your question about British preparation, the British realized that they, needed to prepare. And so they created what's called the Home Guard, which is everything from kind of young boys to old men with a whole wide range of weapons and kind of uniforms and training like that. Think of like a local militia force. They also got volunteers to be coast watchers, so to look out for boats and look out for an invasion force. They got people to be air raid wardens, to go around and see if there were paratroopers, to listen for and look for German aircraft flying over. And in this respect, the British people and the British government did a fantastic job of organizing their people for war and for kind of a total defense of their island, the way Churchill talked about it, that we will defend our island, whatever the cost is going to be, and we're going to fight in the streets and in the hills and on the beaches and landing grounds and all that wonderful stuff. They really did that. And fortunately for them, they never had to use it. But in the moment, there was an absolute true fear of an invasion. They thought it was going to happen any day, and they made preparations for it. We know now that that was never a particularly realistic kind of thing for the Germans to do. And actually Hitler's best hope and what he wanted was to cut some kind of deal with the party, in opposition to Churchill. With them, cut some deal. You can keep your overseas empire and part of your fleet if you recognize me as the kind of master of continental Europe. Hitler would have almost certainly taken that deal, in part because of the difficulty of invasion, in part because he wanted to move east and attack Russia.
Thinking of the things that we know now versus what they knew then, did Churchill and British know that Nazi Germany would have had such a hard time transporting their troops across the channel, or did they think, oh, we don't really know, for all we know, they do have this great navy that we just don't know yet?
They had pretty good naval intelligence about the kind of size and strength of the German Navy. They also realized that the kind of second biggest fleet in the world was the Royal Navy, and that in the event of a attack across the channel, it's kind of one of those things. They could sortie their Navy, and if there ever was a moment for the Royal Navy to fight, to sacrifice, that would be it, to directly repel an invasion across the channel. Part of why the Battle of Britain and kind of the air battles and things that happen after the fall of France are so important is Germany's plan was to use barges and give them lots of air cover if they could kind of win air supremacy over the English Channel, give them lots of air cover and surge very quickly kind of as a surprise attack across the English Channel before the British could bring their fleets in. But even that would have been a very, very difficult operation to pull off. And it was built on the assumption of German air dominance, which never happened. So, we know now it was pretty unlikely. And part of why Churchill was as confident as he was that he realized it was a very difficult military operation, especially as long as the British Air Force and Navy were still in place.
Yeah. It sounds almost like what we saw with the Germans doing with Blitzkrieg, almost, just a little bit across the channel, but with air superiority being so necessary for that.
Yeah, I mean, a comparable kind of thing is the Allied invasion across that same body of water, 4 years later. The Americans and British had enormous economic advantages. They had unchallenged naval and air dominance, and they built up their forces for several years prior to the D-Day invasion. And they had complete surprise. The Germans did not know they were coming. And they still almost failed at the D-Day landings. It was closer than a lot of the Allied planners would have wanted. So they had massive air advantage, massive naval advantage, 2 years to build up, a lot more stuff, and complete surprise at the point of attack, and still almost lost. The Germans couldn't count on any of that. They couldn't count on surprise. They couldn't count on naval or air. They didn't have 2 years to build up. They had to do it quickly. Right, all those things that had to go right for the Americans and the British to do it 4 years later would have had to go right for a German military that was much smaller, much poorer, had much less time and much less capability.
That's a great point. I'd never thought of the comparison to D-Day.
Yeah, the best case scenario I've ever seen for what a German invasion would look like, British General Kenneth McCaskey did kind of a thought experiment, kind of fictitious kind of war plan for what a German invasion would look like. It's called Invasion, They're Coming. And he says the best case scenario, it's still really, really hard for the Germans to pull off. One of his workarounds for British naval dominance is, in theory, the Germans could put a lot of naval mines in the English Channel to kind of stop the British naval forces from coming over. But even that, I find really hard to believe.
Yeah. Yeah, well, that all makes perfect sense. It also makes sense, with the movies suggesting that even though it's really not likely, we still should have some sort of preparation just in case, because you never know.
Yeah, and the Home Guard and other preparedness kind of measures that the British did, they were really good for morale. Because, well, what can I do? I'm an old, World War I veteran. I'm too old to fight, and what can I do? I can guard the beach. I can man a radio or a telephone and stay up late and see if the Germans are going to invade the beach tonight. That is very good for kind of national unity and morale. And it's one of the things Churchill understood, is that if the British people kind of got together and thought they could win and thought they all had a job to do, victory could be had. And I think, if you think about the importance of Winston Churchill's speeches, and if you think about the importance of him as a war leader, that kind of national unity and that national sense of purpose that he brought out with his speeches, and that kind of morale. And yes, victory will not be easy. It will be blood, toils, tears, and sweat. But we can win if we all work together. I think that's Churchill's biggest contribution during the time frame of this movie, but also, more generally in terms of Allied victory in World War II.
Near the end of the movie, we see a turnaround for the support for Churchill. He has a meeting with King George, and he tells Churchill that even though some of the country dreaded his appointment as prime minister, Churchill's appointment as prime minister, Adolf Hitler dreaded it even more. And whomever can strike fear into that brute heart, what King George says, is worthy of all of our trust. And the movie, this happens on May 27th. There's dates that are shown in the movie. And the movie started on May 9th. So it really didn't seem to take long for Churchill to get the king's support. But it sounds like the king started to support Churchill, not really because of anything that Churchill did, but because how much Hitler didn't like Churchill. And then the next day in the movie's timeline, we see Chamberlain now seems to be supporting Churchill as well. Churchill gives his "We Shall Never Surrender" speech, and Chamberlain supports him after that. Can you fill in some more context around how Churchill eventually won over the support of those who seemed to oppose him before?
Well, so in regards to the king, King George did not trust Churchill, did not trust Churchill. And a whole bunch of reasons, many of which we've already discussed, mostly going back to this view that Churchill was a schemer and kind of this dangerous political opportunist and showman. And the biggest kind of example, at least in King George's mind, was that he'd actually backed his brother during the abdication crisis. So initially, the relationship there was very rocky. There was no one point where Churchill and the king made up and were friends and trusted each other. And the scene where the king visits Churchill in the middle of the night and they, smoke together and all of a sudden are friends. Wonderful scene, completely fictitious. Did not happen, would not have happened that way. But it does speak to a broader kind of, and I would say slower change in their relationship. Within several months, I would say, the king realized Churchill was serious, realized that the British people could win, realized that, if they did work together, victory was possible, and that Churchill was the person to do that. But there was no one moment, and it was, I would say, slower and more gradual than the movie would have you suggest. But absolutely, one of Churchill's greatest kind of abilities was to win people over. And he won over a very tough audience in King George. And by the end of the war, they were very close, and they genuinely respected and loved each other. They trusted each other, and were friends by the end of the war. But the way the movie shows it, it's a little too convenient. It's wrapped up in kind of too tight of a package, with a bow on top, in a way that's just not true. Neville Chamberlain, like I kind of was trying to say earlier, he did not particularly like or trust Churchill, but he also was not in this kind of backstabbing cabal, ready to pounce on Churchill at a moment's notice, quite the way the movie says it. He could have been prime minister again, potentially. So he needed to be seen as working with Churchill. He needed to be seen as kind of a loyal member of the Tory party. So he needed to be careful here. And Churchill, the movie actually kind of doesn't do this justice. Churchill was actually able to silence potential dissent from Chamberlain by actually including him in his cabinet. The movie shows that he includes him in his cabinet, but actually makes it out to be a bigger liability for Churchill than it was. Churchill was actually brilliant by bringing people in to his cabinet that opposed him, and then kind of understanding that they needed to not be seen as disloyal. So actually, if I wasn't in the cabinet, I could go behind Churchill's back and talk bad, but because I am in the cabinet, I actually need to at least pretend publicly that I don't have all these issues that I might have, was kind of the way it worked. So Churchill was actually very smart to bring some of these people into his cabinet, and it actually pushed down on dissent rather than the way the movie portrays it, which is there's traitors behind every desk.
You were talking about that fictitious scene with the king and Churchill, and you alluded to this earlier, but at near the end of the movie, there is a moment after, just before actually Churchill's "We Shall Never Surrender" speech. Churchill just disappears from the war cabinet. He goes on the subway. Everyone on the train recognizes him, and it just seems like he's using these people on the train as a focus group. And from that, he gets the idea that, the ordinary British citizens agree with my perspective that we shouldn't negotiate a peace with Germany. And you mentioned earlier that scene didn't happen, but did he do that sort of thing at all? Or was there anything to base that on?
So yeah, the scene didn't happen. And I kind of wish it did, because it really is a beautiful scene. He was very good with common people throughout his kind of political career. He was good at a quick joke. He was good at, kind of showing that he cared, asking about people's jobs, and showing genuine interest in kind of their day-to-day life. And he would ask people how they felt about issues. So again, there is an element of truth to that scene, in that he could do those types of things. He was a politician, and it was important to be able to do that kind of what we call today retail politics, right? Shake hands, kiss babies, make jokes, things like that. He was brilliant at that. There's zero evidence that he did anything like that during this kind of time period. What I will say, I'll kind of say two other things though. That scene has half a dozen little small things where, even though that scene is a lie and a kind of a dangerous lie, whoever wrote it actually knew a fair amount about Churchill. Well, there's the scene where he starts quoting from Macaulay, the poet Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome, about the fighting for the temples of our gods. That was one of Churchill's favorite poems. And he actually, as a schoolboy, had won a prize at school for memorizing some enormous amount. It's a very long poem. He memorized hundreds of lines of that poem and won an award from school for that. So that was not picked by accident. That is, so whoever picked that poem knew it was an important poem for Churchill, and that he would have had it memorized. So again, this kind of odd, uncanny valley of, wow, that's really close, but it's also completely happened. The other thing that he makes a joke about the little baby, well, he looks like you, and he says, ma'am, all babies look like me. That is a joke he commonly used, and he used for years and years and years, that he looked like a little infant baby when he would do these types of things. When he would meet somebody, as a politician, you're going to meet babies, right? So people like to have a politician, fuss over their baby. That was a common joke he used. Again, didn't happen in this scene, happened lots of other times. And again, whoever wrote this scene, made up a scene, but still knew what they were talking about. So again, that kind of uncanny valley right there. The other thing in that scene, he uses his cigar as a political prop. And again, he would often use cigars as kind of his way to brand himself. He would often carry cigars and make a big show out of pulling one out of his pocket, giving one to somebody, lighting one very demonstratively while he was thinking about what to say and things like that. He does that on the train as well. So like just three things that like are 100% right in a scene that as a whole is 100% wrong. Again, it's part of why I, as a biographer, love and hate this movie at the same time.
Yeah, a completely fictional scene. But if it did happen, it could have happened that way.
Yeah, and interesting enough, Churchill bragged about never taking the underground during his life. So it's kind of an odd thing. The other thing I'll say, about Churchill and kind of how he's remembered today, and why he was important for kind of telling the British people they could win and keeping their spirits up. He was excellent at visiting bomb-damaged houses and visiting hospitals and military bases during World War II. His style of leadership was a very personal, this area of London was hit very heavily last night by bombs. I'm going to get in my car and drive over there and talk to the bricklayers and talk to the, people that lost their house. And, I can't rebuild their house. He actually was a bricklayer, but I can't rebuild their house, or at least not right now, but I can tell them I care. And I can tell them we will beat Hitler and kind of keep a stiff upper lip. He did that. And that was somewhat unusual for politicians at the time, and really important to kind of, again, keeping morale up and telling people they can win, telling people that good times are ahead of them and to fight now. And I think it's so obvious that it's almost easy to lose.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's that sort of thing that's the title of the movie, Darkest Hour, when you're going through that, we're going through this together. Like, obviously things are not easy now, but that makes sense that would be a way that a politician like Churchill could help to bring everybody together and to build that moral support that's needed.
And it's one of those things. It's tempting to think of Churchill as a man of the people. He was good with the people. He was not a man of the people.
Difference.
Yeah. So he never cooked. He tried to cook an egg one time, for example. He never did laundry. He never made his bed. He was a privileged member of the British upper class. He had servants and people to do those things. He was kind of a wimp and a kind of a physical way. He often was he had very soft skin, for example. So he didn't want to touch rough fabrics on his skin and stuff like that. He was not a man of the people in that way. He was wealthy. He was privileged. He was, all those things, but he could still at least pretend like he cared. And I think that care was genuine, but it's also very important to he was not your poor boy done good type politician. And wouldn't even really pretend to be.
Yeah. Yeah. But the movie ends in 1940, and that's obviously not the end of Churchill's story. So can you give us like a brief overview of Churchill's life after the timeline of the movie? I'm sure, again, that could be its own whole thing.
Yeah. That's probably 10 different movies. So Churchill remains the British prime minister for the rest of the war in Europe, survives a couple of no confidence votes during the war. So kind of the movie actually picks up on that. His political position was weak. Survives a couple of no confidence votes during the war. There's an election right after the war in Europe is over, while Britain is still fighting Japan in the Pacific theater. And Churchill actually loses that election. So the kind of the Labour Party actually wins a surprise victory, and it's seen as a mandate actually against, we've won the war in Europe, the crisis is over. We can actually get rid of Churchill and focus on other things that the Labour Party's actually promised us, like jobs, like a wage, like healthcare, all the things that Churchill had kind of put on pause to win the war in Europe. So he almost as soon as the war in Europe's over, he's out of office as prime minister. He goes back into to the opposition. He actually gets to be prime minister again in the 1950s. Kind of holds on a little bit too long. His age and health problems kind of catch up to him. But he paints, he travels, he continues to be a best-selling author after the war. He wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. He gives a series of speeches, like the famous Iron Curtain speech about the Cold War. And he kind of solidifies this legacy as one of the greatest British politicians of all time. He dies in 1965 at the age of 90. And, again, kind of has 5 lifetimes worth of stuff just in the kind of time after the movie. But quite a bit of stuff. And it's all pretty amazing.
Throughout the movie, there were a lot of things that made me question how things could have been different. Are you open to maybe doing some what if scenarios from the movie?
They're always dangerous because you never know. But yeah, I'm happy to do so.
Kind of the first what if that I had, according to the movie, as we talked about, it seems like Winston Churchill was not the first choice for prime minister after Chamberlain. So what do you think? What if Churchill was not appointed prime minister in May of 1940? How would that have affected the evacuation of Dunkirk and really the rest of the war?
So Dunkirk really is the key. I think if you had a different politician that is suddenly presented with the fact that the 300,000 or so soldiers that they thought were going to get killed or captured are suddenly saved and delivered back to Britain, I think that would strengthen the resolve of a lot of politicians. So it's entirely possible that somebody else would have understood that deliverance at Dunkirk gave the British an opportunity to continue fighting that they might not have had. But again, it's one of those what ifs that's really hard to know. There definitely was a group of politicians that saw continued resistance as unlikely to succeed and ultimately self-destructive, and thought, even though they didn't particularly care for the Nazis, thought a negotiated settlement that would allow them to keep their empire, keep their kind of sovereignty was the right thing to do. So it's impossible to know. There was a group of people that would have gladly cut a deal with the Nazis, or reluctantly cut a deal with the Nazis, depending on which person. But it's hard to know. But Churchill looks good in retrospect because he made that tough call. We're going to keep fighting, and ultimately was borne out by history.
Yeah. You alluded to kind of my next what if, and that is the peace element, because in the movie, it seems like there are people who want to negotiate a peace with Germany, but Churchill seems to be the one that's kind of standing strong. He's never going to have peace with Hitler. What do you think would have changed? Like, what if Britain had negotiated peace with Germany in 1940?
If they had, I think the world is much worse than it is today. I think you have a much more complete eradication of Jews in Europe. You have a much worse persecution of a whole bunch of other groups, gypsies, LGBTQ, all those types of groups get murdered in a much more complete and systematic way. I think Germany is much more likely to win its war against the Soviet Union without British and American help. I think Britain, without Britain involved, America stays out of the war in Europe. And the idea of an invasion of France or somewhere else in Europe to liberate Europe is almost unthinkable. So it's a much kind of worse hypothetical future. And, it's worth remembering, if Churchill or somebody hadn't have decided to keep fighting, that's what you're looking at. And it's a very, very sad, dark future if Britain folds or decides to negotiate.
It's not darkest hour anymore. It's the darkest future, it seems.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to imagine good things coming out of that.
Maybe you already answered kind of my last what if when we were talking about the invasion, but in the movie, with the implication or the impression of, that's possible that the Germans could invade. What if they had invaded? Do you think Britain would have been able to repel and then damage German forces, or would German eventually have been able to succeed? How do you think that would have changed if Germany had invaded Britain?
I kind of side with Churchill here that if Germany would have tried an invasion, at least in the kind of early period, they would have almost certainly lost. And that would have actually accelerated their own demise. And I think ultimately the Germans decide not to invade because they realize they probably can't win. So, to kind of fight the question a little bit, I think once the army is saved and relocated to Great Britain, they have a large enough force to defend their island from any kind of likely invasion. It's also just important to remember Germany was a land power, not a sea power, and just physically getting enough people and enough stuff across the English Channel, very, very, very hard to do. So, to kind of go back to the previous question, what you get is for a while kind of a standoff, right? Britain is alone and they're still fighting. Germany is master of Europe, and there's this kind of uncomfortable standoff for quite some time there. It would have been much worse if Britain's off the table, but yeah.
Yeah, well, fortunately, those are what if scenarios and not what actually happened. You mentioned earlier Churchill's wife, Clementine, and throughout the movie, we see her, of course, but it focuses on Churchill throughout the movie. But we do see Clementine as well as another woman, Elizabeth Leighton, who is his secretary. She doesn't really stand up to him the way that Clementine does, but she's working with him all hours of the night, anytime, typing telegrams, speeches that he dictates to her. How well do you think the movie does showing these two women as a part of Churchill's life?
I think it does a fantastic job with Clementine, and down to just little tiny details. For example, she tells them one scene is so quick you can miss it. She says, go to bed, pig. Their pet name for each other were Pig. So she could tell the Prime Minister of England, go to bed, Pig. And that's kind of how much they loved and trusted each other. It also shows her struggling to pay the bills. Very true. During this period, during pretty much their entire married life, right up to the end of World War II, they were right near the edge of bankruptcy. Churchill made an enormous amount of money and very, very quickly, and would spend an enormous amount of money just as quick. So they're always on this kind of edge of bankruptcy, and I think it does a good job of briefly highlighting that. Also, the scene where they're toasting each other with champagne, the scene where Clementine says, hey, we've put up with a lot too. You better be a good prime minister. I think I don't know if that exact thing happened, but in terms of kind of showing their relationship and showing the kind of tough love that she had for him and the kind of unflinching support she had for him and the just kind of intimate understanding they had of each other, I think he does a really good job on that. On the character of Miss Leighton, the typist, a lot of stuff wrong with that. So there was a historical Miss Leighton, and she was a typist for Winston Churchill. Churchill did treat her very rudely at various times, and that's about where the right things in the movie end. So she didn't become Churchill's typist till the spring of 1941, almost a year after the movie. She did not have a brother that was killed in the Dunkirk or Calais fighting. She didn't help him type any of these speeches like that. She was one of several personal typists. It wasn't like she was his only one, the way it's kind of suggested in the movie. Lots of things wrong with that. If you want her side of the story, she wrote a pretty readable memoir that came out in the 1950s, which is a good combination of kind of Churchill was a pain in the butt, but I loved him, kind of showed some of his less flattering things, and actually talked quite a bit about how he was often rude, and talks about the thing about the double spacing on the typing and how it was difficult to sometimes hear various words when he was talking with a cigar in his mouth or talking rapidly. The difficulty of that job, she's very quick to highlight. But at the same time, she talks about, but I love this man unconditionally, and he was, the savior of our country. So yes, there was a person like that. Yes, she was his typist. Yes, they had problems. Yes, the double space thing. Lots of little small details. Unfortunately, the timeline's a year off. And then the plot device of I'm worried about my brother never happened. Her family was actually in Canada at the time, I believe. So they weren't in danger at all. So again, one of these things where it's in that uncanny valley because there's enough truth and enough things that are, wow, that's a really cool detail. The double spacing on the page. Oh, wow, but it's a year off, So it's, again, one of these, as a biographer, as a historian, it's really hard to give it a good grade, even though it gets a lot of things amazingly right.
A lot of those little details, things like that, I think it helps to humanize Churchill as a person throughout the movie, like him caring about Elizabeth Layton's brother in that, even if it didn't actually happen.
Yeah, I mean, the same thing about the V for victory and her kind of saying, you know what that means? It means that's a year off as well. So the V for victory didn't come until 1941. Churchill did actually on occasion give it the wrong way, which is kind of the British equivalent of the middle finger in America. And there were pictures of him giving it the wrong way. And he did have to have it explained to him like, hey, that's a vulgar gesture. But it didn't happen in this tight timeline. It was actually about a year later. And it's unclear whether Miss Layton or who exactly said, hey, you're kind of doing that wrong. Again, it's one of those, it's so close yet so far away to being right. And I actually think it's kind of unnecessary for the film to do some of those things.
Since you mentioned some of the little details that the movie got right, were there any of the other little details that the movie got wrong?
Well, I'll give you two, one big, one small. The biggest thing the movie gets wrong is the climactic speech, the "we will fight on the beaches" speech. They actually get the time wrong. They say they have that wonderful plot device of the dates rotating up, and they say that it's on May 28th. That actual speech was on June 4th. And it's not just they were off by a couple of days. The timeline there is really important because by June 4th, the evacuation of Dunkirk had been completed. And Churchill could go give that speech knowing that the kind of core of the British Army had been saved and they could continue fighting and those soldiers couldn't be used as prisoners in a possible deal with the Nazis. He was in a much stronger position to make that speech after those soldiers were saved. And the movie kind of makes it seem like because it's on the 28th of May, the evacuation is still going. We don't know what'll happen. And Churchill then, pulls from the strength of the people on the train and does that. Didn't pull from the people on the train, didn't do it while the evacuation was going. Was in a much kind of different position. Dramatically, it makes more sense to do it on the 28th when he doesn't know that because it seems like much more of a courageous stance by Churchill. But that's one of the biggest kind of things right there. One minor thing is, aviation people like to be aviation people, but the plane that he takes when he does the trip to France is completely wrong. He flew on a de Havilland Flamingo in real life, which was a kind of a rare aircraft even then. It was kind of an unsafe aircraft even then. But when he flew over to France, he did it on a completely different plane. The plane that showed is actually an American aircraft, C-47, which he did fly on those at various points during his career, various points during World War II. But in his trips to France, it was very clear that he flew on a de Havilland Flamingo. There's lots of little things like that where it's just kind of anachronistic or wrong. And you might not notice because it is a World War II plane. It looks really good on film. It's dramatically kind of backlit in some of the scenes. It's also just wrong. And it's one of those things that it didn't have to be wrong because you could have made that change pretty easily, I think. Just one big and one small example that hadn't spoken of before.
Yeah. Those are definitely, especially the speech with the date, because a date is something that's presented on screen. That's the easiest thing to change. I'm wondering, just speculating here, I have no idea, but the filmmakers were trying to make sure the entire movie happens within the same month, since it starts in May, having it also be in May near the end, that kind of thing.
Yeah. it could be just that simple, or it could be the dramatic device of, we want this to be really one right on top of each other. We still want to have that dramatic tension about, we don't know that the Dunkirk evacuation will be successful. But yeah, the use of the dates that explicitly just drives you crazy if you actually know what to look for. And again, what I worry as a professor is that somebody will see that date and then have it in their mind, or worse yet, in their paper or their retelling of the historical tale of, it happened on this date. Actually, no, it didn't. But very frustrating.
Always double check the movies. They're not always accurate.
Yeah. Watch Dan's podcast.
Read your book. There you go. How well do you think the movie did with just Gary Oldman portraying Winston Churchill?
I think that's one of, if the film is going to be remembered for anything, it will be for Gary Oldman's performance. It is amazing. And he apparently did over a year and a half of study for that character, and lots of vocal coaching and things like that. And he deserves, in my opinion, I'm not on the Academy, but he absolutely deserves the Best Actor award that he won. I believe the other award that it won was makeup, and I think, again, the prosthetics on his face, the attention to detail on some of that stuff is absolutely amazing. And really, in that moment, he is Winston Churchill. And I think he does a very, very, very good job on even very little kind of things, on the way he would pronounce certain words, the way he would slur the word Nazis, right? You and I would say it Nazi. He would say Nazis. And very kind of subtle things like that, again, if you don't know what to look for, it just sounds like a odd British accent. But boy, that's attention to detail on like vocal coaching of how you pronounce the like second syllable in Nazis. Really good. And he deserves all the kind of accolades he got for that.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's good to hear. I mean, he's one of my favorite actors. He just transformed. It seems like he transforms himself in each role. So when I saw this movie, I was like, wow, it doesn't look like Gary Oldman. It does, but it doesn't at the same time. They did a really good job transforming, I thought.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on to chat about Darkest Hour. Now, we've talked a lot about Winston Churchill today, and we also mentioned he's the kind of person that can have so many different stories from his life, even beyond what we saw in this movie. And some of those stories you talk about in your forthcoming book, Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint, the remarkable year that made Winston Churchill. Can you give us a sneak peek of your new book?
So the book that'll be coming out in 2024, Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint. So it looks at a one-year period of Churchill's life from the spring of 1915 to the spring of 1916. It starts when he was the head of the British Admiralty during World War I, and actually kind of dreams up this attack on the Gallipoli Peninsula that's mentioned again and again and again as one of his greatest failures during the Darkest Hour movie. It starts with the failure of that campaign, and Winston Churchill actually losing his job as head of the British Admiralty during World War I. It then is a tale of redemption. So the blood of failure at Gallipoli, two parts to his redemption. One is he goes and gives up his job as First Lord of the Admiralty and goes and fights in the front lines of World War I in Belgium, and at great personal risk to himself, actually is in the trenches fighting in World War I. And it's kind of this redemptive thing of, I failed, but at least I am not a coward, and I am putting my money where my mouth is, that we should fight and sacrifice and beat the Germans in World War I. So he goes and does that. During this year, he also kind of by accident discovers painting, and painting becomes kind of his hobby for the remainder of his life. And it's kind of his way of, when he's stressed out, when he's tired, he needs time to kind of recharge the batteries, he goes and paints. So it's kind of a two-part redemption. One is, I'm going to show I'm a tough guy, and in the public mind, I can go fight. And one is, I'm going to cultivate a creative, kind of artistic, softer part of my personality in my private moments. So it's Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint. It looks at this one-year period of his life where he fails spectacularly, fights in the trenches, and finds a hobby that he will continue the rest of his life.
I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. It's always fun to be on the show.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Furman Daniel once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the movie Darkest Hour. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Furman has a new book coming out called Blood, Mud, and Oil Paint, the remarkable year that made Winston Churchill. But that book is slated to be coming out a little bit later this year. So as of this recording, it's not available yet. When it is available, I'll make sure to add a link to it in the show notes for this episode. So if you are listening to this in the future, look for that. Until then, I'll add a link to Furman's other books so you can check out those until his Churchill book is published. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, Churchill didn't really visit the subway to see how British people felt about peace with Germany. Number 2, Miss Layton was Churchill's secretary through the evacuation of Dunkirk. Number 3, the climactic speech at the end of the movie was shown on the wrong day. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's start with number 1. Churchill didn't really visit the subway to see how British people felt about peace with Germany. That is true. And by true, I mean it is true that Churchill did not go into the subway to form sort of a focus group like we see happening in the movie. Although Furman did point out that the movie did a good job of showing how Churchill acted around people, like the joke about the woman's baby looking like him. But that scene in the subway didn't happen. That brings us to number 2. Miss Layton was Churchill's secretary through the evacuation of Dunkirk. That's the lie. Miss Layton was Churchill's typist, but as we learned from Furman, she didn't become his typist until 1941. So after the timeline of the movie and after the evacuation of Dunkirk in 1940. That means number 3 is also true. The climactic speech at the end of the movie was shown on the wrong day. As Furman told us, the movie said that Churchill gave his "We shall fight on the beaches" speech on May 28th, but he actually gave it on June 4th. While that is just a few days difference, that is important because in those days is when the miracle at Dunkirk took place. So when Churchill gave his speech, he already knew that most of the soldiers had been rescued. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If you did hear ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed, either on Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. Learn all about that or some completely free ways that you can give some value back to Based on a True Story over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value, or use the link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.